often the case that where an investigation goes wrong, there's a human element to it. So HR issues should generally be front and centre, or at least considered at the outset rather than an afterthought. I think one of the common mistakes we tend to see is control functions in HR working in silos. So you may have risk and compliance, or perhaps legal or internal audit working away on a confidential and perhaps legally privileged investigation. This may involve bet the farm issues, perhaps the risk of huge fines or public censure by a regulator. In parallel, you may have HR dealing with some of the suspected perpetrators. This may be in the context of disciplinary processes around the very conduct being closely guarded by other parts of the organisation. Now, this can result in some catastrophic results from a corporate risk perspective. As we all know, employee disciplinaries can become highly contentious, and it's relatively common for employees to lawyer up and raise grievances and claims of their own. This can result in the HR side of the equation becoming a runaway train, and the disciplinary process generating hundreds or thousands of open and disclosable documents that could prove unhelpful to the wider corporate liability issues sitting further up the risk register. So it's really important for the various functions to be joined up, and for the strategy from an HR perspective to take into account the potential collateral damage of a disciplinary process. For example, having all the matters play out in a very public employment tribunal when the objective was to contain issues and minimise reputational and regulatory exposure. Now, what this looks like in reality will vary from one investigation to the next and may depend on the regulatory environment and the extent to which issues of legal privilege are paramount. But we may be talking here about things like placing employees on a period of paid administrative leave or suspension for an extended period, something that generally goes against the rules of best practice from an employment law perspective, but may be appropriate in the context of a wider investigation. And ultimately delaying any disciplinary action until such time as a company has its arms around the bigger issue and the risk of leaks or collateral litigation is more palatable. I think the other point worth noting here is that increasingly it's the case that big corporates are keen to have and demonstrate that they have purpose and that they have a positive culture, particularly important within financial services. And the human reaction to investigations can be very telling in this regard. So it's really more important than ever to get this right from an HR perspective.
So often in an investigation, there are a number of different competing risks, of which the HR risks are only one. There may be regulatory risk, there may be potential liability to third parties, there may be data protection issues. And whether or not the HR issues trump or win in that battle of risks will depend on the circumstances. But quite often, for example, the regulatory risk will take precedence over the HR processes, which can make it quite difficult to manage the HR aspect of an investigation. Another example is legal privilege, where what we can often see is that from a regulatory perspective, to manage that risk, or because we don't want to create a disclosable chain of documentation relating to a third-party liability, the investigation would be conducted on a privileged basis. But from an HR perspective, we actually want to be able to demonstrate that we followed due process and for the investigation to be open. So I guess the key thing to remember is any action in an investigation, including following HR process, can have unintended consequences, and always to think outside just following an HR process and what may be the result of your action.
We're seeing a lot more investigations generated by employee-related issues, triggered by things like the Me Too movement, Black Lives Matter, and so on, all of which bring their own particular complexities to investigations. Employees are also now much more willing to blow the whistle, which also triggers various statutory protections and, in regulated businesses, perhaps obligations to self-report. Finally, we're also seeing management of mental health issues taking much greater prominence. Employee involvement in investigations, whether that's as complainant or witness or perpetrator or even decision maker, creates a highly stressful environment for individuals. Mental health has received a lot of attention this past year, but never is that more prescient than in the acute, stressful environment of an investigation. Businesses should give careful consideration to the amount of support that they can provide to the employees who are involved in a matter, whether that's in the particular high-stress environment that they find themselves in at that point, or to help manage longer-term underlying mental health issues. Standard occupational health services or employee assistance programs may not be sufficient.